Hello, I'm Dr. David Kenley, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Dakota State University. I have been asked to do this short presentation on protests in Chinese society and to look at the ways in which these protests impact China and the lessons that we can learn from studying them. Protests have played a large role in Chinese history and continue to do so today. For the next few moments, I want to discuss three major protests in the 20th century. As I do so, I challenge you to reflect on a couple of questions. Let me take a step back. Two protests in the 20th century and one in the 21st century. So reflect on these questions with me, please. First, what is the role of protest in a democratic society? And second, a similar question, what is the role of protest in a non-democratic society? Let's start by looking at the May 4th protests of 1919. As you may remember, in the spring of 1919, delegates from around the world gathered in Paris to craft a formal peace treaty to end World War I. Naturally, the leaders of the victorious countries played the dominant role in these meetings, with delegates from the losing countries invited at the end to simply sign the document. China, who was allied with the winning nations, sent delegates to Paris. Within days, however, the Chinese delegates saw themselves relegated to the sidelines. In particular, England, France, and Japan included terms in the treaty that were clearly an affront to Chinese sovereignty. Specifically, they carved out a portion of China's territory and awarded it to Japan as a naval base and colony. In response to these actions in Paris, approximately 4,000 college-aged students gathered in the capital city of Beijing on May 4th to protest against both the Western powers as well as their own weak national leaders. Law enforcement officers arrested nearly 1,000 protest participants. But over the next several days, similar protests erupted across China and even among China's immigrant communities in Southeast Asia. Responding to these ongoing protests, government officials released the jailed participants and dropped all charges. Nevertheless, the Paris Peace Conference continued unabated, and the Chinese territory was eventually given to Japan. However, the protests were not a total failure. First, the Chinese delegates in Paris took a cue from the protesters and refused to sign the final treaty. Second, the protesters galvanized nationalist sentiment in China that transcended class, ethnicity, age, and gender. Today, many historians describe the May 4th protests as the birth of modern Chinese nationalism. Perhaps most importantly, the protesters inspired a handful of individuals who gathered in the aftermath of May 4th and created the Chinese Communist Party, which would eventually go on to overthrow the government and establish the People's Republic in 1949. The second protest I want to briefly discuss occurred in the late spring of 1989, 40 years after the communists took power and exactly 70 years after the May 4th protests. Once again, students played a leading role, gathering in Beijing in a large public plaza known as Tiananmen Square. According to early reports, they were coming together to mourn the recent death of a pro-reform leader named Hu Yaobang. Since Hu Yaobang was a prominent party member, it was difficult for government officials to justify suppressing the gathering. However, it soon became clear that the students were not only mourning the loss of a progressive leader, but more importantly, were using this leader's post-mortem reputation to call for significant reforms to the Communist Party and the state apparatus. Within a few days, The number of protesters on the square reached 1 million. They also erected a goddess of democracy that bore a striking resemblance to the Statue of Liberty in New York. Protest leaders demanded an audience with Communist Party officials, ostensibly to discuss greater democratization, an end to party corruption, guaranteed personal liberties, and greater economic opportunity. In actuality, the goals of the 1 million protesters varied greatly from person to person. For nearly 6 weeks, government officials privately debated how best to respond to the protests. In the meantime, the numbers on Tiananmen Square continued to grow. Eventually, officials came to a decision. The protesters were a dangerously destabilizing force and therefore enemies of the state. On May 20th, the government declared martial law and military troops began converging on the capital. During the evening of June 3rd and throughout the day of June 4th, Army troops forcibly cleared the square using live ammunition and tanks. By the end of the day, much of downtown Beijing looked like a war zone. Though the figures continue to be disputed, most observers estimate the number of protesters killed to be anywhere from a few hundred to a few thousand. As with the May 4th protesters, the Tiananmen protesters failed to achieve their immediate goals. Nevertheless, like May 4th, there were many unintended consequences. First, there was an immediate change in Communist Party leadership, with more progressive individuals such as Zhao Ziyang purged and replaced with more conservative leaders such as Jiang Zemin. Second, China was isolated within the international community for the next several years. And perhaps most importantly, many party leaders learned that protests must be controlled, redirected, or preferably eliminated before they have the potential to be destabilizing. The third protest I want to discuss took place in Hong Kong in the spring of 2019, the centennial of May 4th, and the 40th anniversary of Tiananmen. Hong Kong, as you may remember, was a British colony between 1842 and 1997. When it reverted to Chinese control at the end of the 20th century, leaders in Beijing promised that Hong Kongers would continue to enjoy the financial, political, and social autonomy they had come to expect. However, in 2019, China sought to create an agreement, or extradition treaty, whereby individuals charged with a crime could be taken from semi-autonomous Hong Kong and tried for the alleged offense in China. Believing that this agreement would result in political prisoners being removed from Hong Kong and tried unfairly in Chinese courts, thousands of Hong Kongers flooded the streets in protest. Leaders in Beijing worried that a heavy-handed crackdown on protesters would bring about international condemnation, similar to what happened following the crackdown in Tiananmen in 1981. They also realized this would be a clear violation of the promises made to Hong Kongers at the time of transition from British to Chinese control. Therefore, leaders in Beijing tried to contain and moderate the impact of the Hong Kong protests. Instead, the protests grew larger and more disruptive throughout the summer of 2019. Eventually, political leaders rescinded the extradition treaty, but by then the damage was already done. Protesters have no faith in Beijing's promises and no faith in their own local Hong Kong government officials. Consequently, the protests continue. Recognizing the situation was quickly getting out of hand, government officials in Beijing passed a new national security law, enabling them to arrest Hong Kong's protest leaders and other pro-democracy elements in society. The COVID-19 pandemic also provided an excuse to impose curfews and outlaw protests in the name of social distancing and public health. Today, relative calm has returned to the streets of Hong Kong, but China has used the national security law to arrest and detain dozens of protesters, newspaper editors, and other outspoken critics of the government. So, what do these three seminal events, 1919, 1989, and 2019, teach us about the role of protests in Chinese society? China's governing officials, like their counterparts in other countries, are wary of the destabilizing effects public protests can have. Consequently, party and government leaders seek to stop any protests before they form or balloon out of control. Plainclothed police officers frequently break up protests, often by force. Transportation officials deny train tickets to people they suspect are traveling to Beijing or other important protest sites. And when all else fails, as seen in the case of the Tiananmen Square and Hong Kong protests, the government relies on armed forces and security officials to neutralize or eliminate protests. At the same time, officials know it's impossible to eliminate all forms of protest. Instead, the government allows for certain types of protests while seeking to control and even capitalize on their potential benefits. For instance, officials in Beijing laud the May 4th protest as the impetus for the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, yet they simultaneously gloss over the pro-democracy elements of May 4th. To give another example, in May of 1999, the 80th anniversary of the May 4th protests and the 10th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square protests, government officials were on edge, fearful of another such event. Coincidentally, that same month, the United States bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, claiming it was an accident. Anti-American protests immediately broke out in Beijing. Within hours, buses were provided to shuttle angry college students to the U.S. Embassy, where armed police officers watched as the protesters shouted out vulgarities of the United States and vandalized the U.S. Embassy with improvised weapons. To many observers, it appeared as though government officials were intentionally supporting the anti-American protests to advance their foreign relation goals. At a minimum, the protests served as a release valve and distracted Chinese citizens from commemorating the May 4th or the Tiananmen anniversaries. Before concluding this video essay, I want to point out the growing importance of social media as it relates to protests. While this is not a prototypical venue for protests, social media is playing an increasingly important role as a conduit for demonstrations, and there are many interesting comparisons to be made. It is helpful to compare protests in China with those in other parts of the world. For instance, how might the U.S. Black Lives Matter protests of 2019 compare with protests in China? Similarly, why were so many Americans angry at the vandalism and destruction that accompanied the Black Lives Matter protests? How do you determine when protests cross the line between legitimate public expression and dangerous lawlessness? By making such meaningful comparisons, we are better able to appreciate the role of protests in China and around the world. Thank you.